in which the antithesis is constituted in this ethical realm is such that self-consciousness has not yet received its due as a particular individuality. There it has the value, on the one hand, merely of the universal will, and on the other of consanguinity. This particular individual counts only as a shadowy unreality. As yet, no deed has been committed, but the deed is the actual self. It disturbs the peaceful organization and movement of the ethical world. What there appears as order and harmony of its two essences, each of which authenticates and completes the other, becomes through the deed a transition of opposites in which each proves itself to be the non-reality rather than the authentication of itself and the other. It becomes the negative movement or the eternal necessity of a dreadful fate which engulfs in the abyss of its single nature divine and human law alike, as well as the two self-consciousnesses in which these powers have their existence, and for us passes over into the absolute being for self of the purely individual self-consciousness. Paragraph 464 now begins the next subsection of the first portion of the Spirit massive section of the work. And we're continuing on with this discussion of the ethical order and the two sides, the human law and the divine law. In this shorter section, we're now going to see them actually coming to a head, and Hegel very early on in this is going to now reintroduce self-consciousness in a very explicit and you might even say disruptive way. And that happens in this very first paragraph. So he tells us that the ethical realm, as we know, is divided into two sides, right? We have human law on one side, and here he's talking about the universal will, allgemeine Will, right? And on the other side, we have the divine law, the realm of the family, and here he's talking about consanguinity, that is, people sharing the same blood. And we've gone through a lot of interesting discussion about the nature of family relations and, the hiddenness of the family as opposed to the manifestness in the public world, the private versus the public. We've talked about the relationship between the family and the divine. We've talked about the nature of government over here on the human law side. All of these things are coming to a head, and Hegel tells us that what we have here is an antithesis within the ethical realm, but it's an antithesis that is not, when we see this term antithesis, we usually think about something where things are jarring with each other. And the way that he talks about it here is, no, not until we introduce action, or as it's being translated here, the deed, right? And the deed is going to be associated with an individual who does the deed. Think back all the way to when we were talking about the attempt to try to understand individuality way back in the reason section in terms of human action, right? There was you might say, slipperiness to human action, particularly the more individual it got. We were always trying to bring it under laws, right? We were always trying to make sense of it in terms of explanatory or normative principles. And it seemed like human beings are that kind of creature where you pin them down here and they wiggle away over here as the individual. Now, as the aggregate, or in terms of the universal, we can perhaps pin them down in this way much more easily. But the problem with that is the universal will doesn't really act without acting through individuals. Nor does consanguinity, the law of the family, the law of the divine, act without being involved with individuals either. So he tells us the way in which the antithesis is constituted in this ethical realm, this antithesis that we've set up here, is such that self-consciousness has not yet received its due as a particular individuality. Does that mean that we don't have self-consciousness? No. As a matter of fact, self-consciousness is existing, but in a general or universal way over here on the side of the human law, perhaps as the government, right? And existing in a kind of inchoate way, you might say self-consciousness that is not fully conscious of itself as self-consciousness on the side of the family. When we get to individuality, particular einzelne individuality, that's when the rubber, that we talk about proverbially hitting the road really does get its gripping point. And so we move from this antithesis into a different antithesis, that of the deed. So he says, before that, the particular individual counts only as a shadowy unreality. So he says, as yet, no deed has been committed. We were sort of setting things up. But the deed is the actual self, action. It's one thing to talk about, say, social dynamics or the arrangement of a society and its culture in terms of these two sides, but it's only when somebody does something, somebody stakes out a position, somebody acts, that all of this really means something and has any true reality. So he goes on and he says, what happens when somebody acts? It disturbs the peaceful organization and movement of the ethical world. So what we had going on here was a sort of, equilibrium or a continual process. Now we're introducing genuine human spontaneity into this process, and it shakes it to pieces, ultimately. So what happens? He says, what there appears as order and harmony of its two essences, right? The universal will and consanguinity, the human law and the divine law, understood in general as forms of self-consciousness, but not yet individual self-consciousness. What there appears as harmony, each of which authenticates and completes the other, each of which is in some way making the other valid, you could say, or adding the side that's needed, right? Until we have actual human beings and their determinate actions being introduced, everything is more or less running smoothly. It's when we introduce real human beings with particular motives, although we're going to see a little bit later on that these motives have to still be moving within the realm of the ethical. They cannot be sort of venial motives, right? Or totally self-centered motives, or those of corruption, right? Trying to make a buck or get something out of it. So long as these individuals view themselves as trying to enact what it is that the family and the divine on the one hand, or the human law and the government require, we're going to have a massive disruption. And a disruption that goes all the way to the core. We might think here, for example, of something that Hegel was talking about much earlier in terms of self-consciousness, going all the way back to the beginning of the self-consciousness section and the master-slave dialectic. When Hegel talked about self-consciousness being shaken to its very core and saying that dialectical progression was not really going to happen unless this being shaken to its very core occurred on the part ultimately of the slave, right? Where the progress then could take place. Something similar is happening here in the ethical domain with these two principles, these two laws. So he goes on and he says, what happens through the deed is there's a transition of opposites. And now I wanted to put this on the board in part because there's a little bit of I don't know if it's a deliberate play on words or if Hegel is just using similar vocabulary. We started out with a Gegensatz, a antithesis, or if you like, contradiction, right? And then soon after that, we're now finding that when we make the transition through the deed to particular individuals who are representing or embodying the universal will and the principle of the family, now we have Entgegengesetzter. We have things that are, you notice the Gegengesetzter here? That's like Gegensatz, right? They're very similar, not exactly the same, but lexically closely related, right? This is actually from a longer composite. You've got the ent. They're set apart and yet in collision with each other, you might say. And that is going to be really critical. What we have here now with these opposites is they are no longer complementary to each other. In fact, something else is occurring. Hegel tells us that rather than being the authentication or the validation of itself and the other, each proves itself to be the non-reality. Each proves itself to be lacking in reality, to be incomplete. So interestingly, the deed which was required to actually make things actual, complete, wirklich, is making them, in some respect, less so. This is actually an advance, however. Hegel goes on and he says, it becomes the negative movement, or the eternal necessity, of a dreadful fate, which engulfs in the abyss of its single nature divine and human law alike, as well as the two self-consciousnesses in which these powers have their existence. So what is happening on both sides is and this is what's going to be happening in the rest of this section, is that each of these is generating not only its own unreality, but also the non-reality of its opposite and of this whole schema to begin with. You might say, if we want to think in terms of how Hegel has figured this before, what they are doing is introducing death as the absolute master in here at this point, as pure negativity. And Hegel will end this paragraph by talking about the absolute being for self of individual consciousness, right? Or individual self-consciousness. That is what everything is passing over into. And now we have to see, well, what does that individual self-consciousness look like in these cases? The ground from which this movement starts and on which it takes place is the ethical realm. What is active in this movement, however, is self-consciousness. Qua ethical consciousness, it is the simple, pure direction of activity towards the essentiality of ethical life, that is, duty. In it there is no caprice and equally no struggle, no indecision, since the making and testing of law has been given up. On the contrary, the essence of ethical life is for this consciousness immediate, unwavering, without contradiction. Consequently, we are not faced with the sorry spectacle of a collision between passion and duty, nor with the comic spectacle of a collision between duty and duty, a collision which, as regards its content, is the same as that between passion and duty. For passion is equally capable of being seen as a duty, because when consciousness separates itself from its immediate, substantial essence and withdraws into itself, it becomes the merely formal universal into which one content as well as another fits equally well, as we found before. But the collision of duties is comic because it expresses a contradiction, that is, the contradiction of an absolute that is opposed to itself. An absolute, and then the nothingness of this so-called absolute or duty. The ethical consciousness, however, knows what it has to do and has already decided whether to belong to the divine or the human law. This immediate firmness of decision is something implicit and therefore has at the same time the significance of a natural being, as we have seen. Nature, not the accident of circumstances or choice, assigns one sex to one law, the other to the other law. Or conversely, the two ethical powers themselves give themselves an individual existence and actualize themselves in the two sexes. In paragraph 485, Hegel is telling us a bit more about the self-consciousness that is engaged in what he's calling the ethical realm. So we're talking about ethical self-consciousness. And remember now at this point that we are talking about an individual self-consciousness that is taking a particular stand. we've moved away from what we could call the general or universal self-consciousness that was associated with one or two of the laws. It's still going to be associated with one or two of them, as we see. There's a choice that has to be made, or at least at the very least something like a commitment, let's call it. But now we're talking about a consciousness that is, individual and oriented entirely, like he puts it here. It's involved in a simplicity that is an activity directed or oriented towards duty, towards Pflicht in Hegel's German. So he tells us what is active in this movement is self-consciousness in order for the ethical realm to be able to do what it does in a way that produces any sort of development. It has to be through individual self-consciousnesses. So he says, qua ethical consciousness, it is the simple, pure direction of activity towards the essentiality of ethical life. The essentiality of ethical life here is what Hegel is calling duty. And that's typically how ethical life is framed. We don't have it simply in terms of these abstract principles. It's, you should do this. And we saw earlier in the entire section on, towards the end of the reason portion of the text, reason giving itself laws and then reason testing laws, we saw what some of those duties in fact could be, like you should, love your neighbor, or you should respect property, or we can go through these things. And these are set out as sort of norms, and at the same time they're incumbent upon a person. So they can be very specific as well. Your parent is old and sick, you must do something in relation to your parent. We could talk about funerary rites. How long do you have to remain in mourning and wearing a certain color and not partaking in certain pleasures? These are all what Hegel is calling duties here. So he says that qua ethical consciousness, it's directed towards duty. And he says, in it, there is no caprice, equally no struggle, no indecision. Why? Because the making and testing of laws has been given up. This is the transition at the end of the reason section into the spirit section. We had this movement from a rational self-consciousness that was giving itself ethical laws as the Sache selbst, as the project, and eventually it reached a point where it transitioned over into finding the ethical substance given to it, and now it commits to that. So there's no caprice, there's no Willkür, right? There's no arbitrariness to this. There's no struggle, no Kampf, as Hegel says. And there's no indecision, or we might even translate it indecisiveness. Unentscheidenheit, right? A lack of Entscheidenheit, a lack of imposing a scheiden, a splitting, I'm taking this and rejecting this. No wavering, no oscillating between that. No second guessing, we might say. So, what do we find in this? He says, on the contrary, the essence of ethical life is for this consciousness. Immediate, unwavering, without contradiction, without Widerspruch. So he goes on and he says, we're not faced with a collision between duty and duty, or duty and passion. Now, why not? Hegel's going to say quite a few things about this. So we're not faced with a collision between duty and duty, because we're going to follow a duty, and collisions between the two of them are not going to arise. There will be duties on the two opposite sides that will themselves find themselves in collision, but those are in different self-consciousnesses. They're not in the same self-consciousness. The one self-consciousness over here knows what its duty is, and the other duty doesn't matter for it. As we're going to see, it ultimately doesn't have reality, as it's discussed in the later paragraphs. Hegel tells us it's not going to be the collision of duty and passion. Here he tells us something quite interesting. He says, a collision between duty and duty would be the same as regards its content as that between passion and duty, Leidenschaft and duty, right? Why? Because passion is equally capable of being seen as a duty. Why is passion equally able as being seen as a duty? Well, we saw this play out in previous shapes of consciousness, didn't we? Like the, pleasure and necessity, or the law of the heart and frenzy of self-conceit. All of these sorts of things that consciousness could identify itself with and say, this is what I desire. This is what is going to drive me. This is where I'll find fulfillment. That can be transformed into something like a duty to oneself. I should enjoy every pleasure available to me. I should become a gourmet, right? Those people take those seriously enough and they turn them into a duty. And now Hegel says something really interesting here. He says, when consciousness separates itself from its immediate substantial essence, which is getting from the ethical sphere, and withdraws into itself, it becomes the merely formal universal into which one content as well as another fits equally well. So we can place whatever we want into it. We can cram whatever happens to fit under this rubric of passion and turn it into a duty. The other thing that he says that's particularly striking about this is that this collision would be comic. Now, usually when we talk about two ethical, imperatives or duties or values running into each other and not being compatible, we don't usually talk about that as comic. We usually talk about that in terms of tragedy. So why is Hegel talking about comedy here? That's a really important question. He says the collision of duties is comic because it expresses a contradiction. What kind of contradiction? The contradiction of an absolute that is opposed to itself. Now, why would that be funny rather than tragic? Well, think about it. An absolute shouldn't be opposed to really anything. Nothing should be able to stand up against it. It should encompass everything. But we find that it's opposed to its very self. Of course, this is inherent in the nature of dialectics, isn't it? But for those who are looking at things in this sense, if some sort of, division arises in the middle of the ethical absolute, well, that is, in certain respects, a catastrophe. From people looking at it from the outside, they're like, oh my God, look at this. They can't get it together. There's something comic, something funny about it. So he says, the nothingness of this so-called absolute or duty is indeed comic. Then he says the ethical consciousness doesn't worry about that. It knows what it has to do. And he says it's already decided for one side or the other. It is decided either for human law or for divine law. It takes its cues from that source. That is what's providing this simplicity here. And it more or less ignores the other law. This is why, we saw just in the paragraph earlier, Hegel was saying when this sort of thing is taking place, through individuality, what we're sort of validating or authenticating each other, these two sides, now are suddenly turned into these opposites to each other that nullify each other. And that is what's going to take place as he goes on. Now, he also tells us that this firmness of decision, he says, has at the same time the significance of a natural being. Nature, not the accident of circumstances or choice, assigns one sex to one law. The male is assigned to human law, female is assigned to divine law, and he says, conversely, the two ethical powers give themselves an individual existence and actualize themselves in the two sexes. So Hegel seems to be saying that there's a kind of gender determinism happening here within the scope of the ethical substance and the splitting into the two laws. One of the questions that we could ask is, does it have to go that way? Was Hegel, so captivated by the Antigone story or narrative that he needed to weave it in this way? Or is there some, is this tied just with older cultures? Or is there something else going on here? And I want to leave that an open question because it's not able to be really resolved at this point. We know that Hegel does want to say the two sexes or two genders are being portioned out by nature. But we saw that there's already more to the story than just some sort of sexual difference going on.